Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I did this rhino drawing in graphite. Now this video is going to have lots of tips on how to draw wrinkles and creases in graphite. Now when I'm working on something like this where there is an awful lot of texture and patterns, a variety of elements that could be very confusing, I do like to break this up into smaller sections and I try to strip this back one layer at a time. Now when working with something like this, I do try to pick out the main areas or something that I might notice first. This may be a clump of fur if it's a complicated fur texture. In this situation, it's going to be the main wrinkles and creases that jump out to me initially. Once I've got those mapped in, when I look back at my reference photo and back at my drawing, I know exactly where I am and there's less time hesitating. Now this hesitation can actually cause a lot more additional confusion to the drawing process. So if I can eliminate that early on, then I know I'm having one less thing to worry about. So in all of my graphite tutorials, I do like to use graphite powder wherever I can. There are a few reasons for this, but primarily I like to be able to create a soft outer focus layer first that's hinting at my main values. Now as I start working with my graphite pencils, this is where I'm going to reinforce those as I build my layers. But I do want to make sure that I've got my very first powdered layer capturing some softness. This can be done using just graphite pencils, but it's far more time consuming and we need to work more with the advanced shading techniques initially to make sure that we don't have any scribble marks or harsh edges. It is possible, but the graphite powder gets this done far quicker. Now when I am working with my graphite pencils, you'll see that it's a very gradual process. I'm not jumping into my darkest pencils first. I like to save those for my later layers. When I'm building in this softness, I might start maybe with a 2H or a HB and then gradually progress up all the way to a 9B. But when I'm working with something that is very dark, the eye here for example, I still build up my layers in multiple stages. One of the main reasons for that is I just feel I'm able to capture more depth, more realism, because then I've got much more of a range of those values. I don't want just to have one darker shadow, a midtone and a highlight. I've got multiple stages of those values. You can see that starting to develop here when I'm working with my erasers. I'm pulling in some of the highlights, but I'm not making all of my highlights as bright as each other. This is going to become more noticeable as I get more of this drawing in place. So another aspect that's really important when drawing wrinkles is that we need to be making sure that they are going in the right direction. You'll see that the ones around the eye are more curved, they're following the shape of that eye socket, whereas the area on the cheek that I'm currently working on, they're far more vertical. They're still curved, there's no straight lines, but I do want to be making sure that I've got this variation. If we start to create an adjustment here, whether or not the lines are too straight or whether or not they are maybe too diagonal, they're too curved, too rounded, that's going to change the shape dramatically. It won't look as much like that reference photo as we would like. So I'm not focusing here on getting every single wrinkle drawn in. That isn't something that I feel is going to make more of a difference here for the level of realism achieved. But I do want to make sure that the main ones I am mapping in, that they are going in the right direction. Now regarding how many of those wrinkles we should be adding, I find this is going to vary depending on the size of the artwork. This was only a 7 by 10 inch, so I did need to be realistic with how many of those I can include. Because trying to force every single one here and add too many details will actually make this look less realistic. We'll either cover up too much of this graphite powder base layer, or we're going to have just far more of a confusing impression of that skin texture. When I'm working with something like this, it is those main ones first of all, and then I'll make a decision on what else I feel I could include in between those areas. When I started working on the nose and the mouth area, I do use the same steps that I've explained already, but there are differences. What I will be doing here later on is coming in with more of my darker pencils and making my contrast sharper. I'll also be making those shadowed areas bigger. And what this will do is help to make these wrinkles look more like deeper creases. So yet again, I'm helping with that variation of this skin texture. But I don't want to be jumping into those darker pencils right away, exactly as I've mentioned previously. You'll see that I'm already starting to get the impression that those darker areas are wider, and this really is going to help add more of this drama and lighting to this drawing. One of the reasons why I really wanted to capture how wide these shadows are is that this is going to help make it look like the light is not able to get down into those deeper folds in the skin. So this will help give that illusion that the skin here is thicker, and that's exactly what I want for this variation. The lighting of any portrait is very important, but especially if it is a one-sided light source. I want to be making sure that I've got the areas dark enough on that one side and the highlights bright enough elsewhere. This is going to add so much additional three-dimensional shape and form to the drawing. This area here is a prime example. You can see that I'm actually darkening my base foundation significantly compared to anywhere else so far. When I later work on the legs, this is all going to help bring that lighting together. And this is also something else that can really help simplify this complex pattern or texture. You'll see that I'm not trying to add my highlights, my darker shadows, my base foundation all at the same time. I really am breaking this up into one stage at a time. Once I've got my darker graphite established, then I can use my erasers to pull in some highlights. Now, my personal preference is not to add a highlight from the very beginning. I do like to add those on top where possible. So in some situations, my base layer might actually look far too dark. But that's because I like to pull in those highlights additionally. Now, if I've got a bright highlight that's the white of the paper, maybe a reflection in the eye or an area that is overexposed, and I like that lighting, I want to capture that in my drawing, then yes, I will absolutely use the white of the paper to my advantage. But on this side of the face, the highlights were not bright white. As I've mentioned previously, I'm going to keep my lightest highlights for more of the top portions of the head. So I knew I had to get a layer of graphite over all of this paper here to make sure that I did recreate that light source. And as I have moved on throughout these layers and built this area up in stages, you can see the contrast, how much wider and darker these areas of the creases are. This is exactly where I want this stage of the drawing to be. The other thing as well is I can always come back to this later on. There's no limit with what layers I can add here, especially if I'm making sure I don't burnish early on. Now, burnishing is where we apply too much pressure or a lot of pressure, not necessarily too much, it's going to depend on the technique, but a lot of pressure early on in that layering process. I do burnish, but I do like to save that more for my later stages. But burnishing will flatten the tooth of the paper because of the additional pressure that we're applying to the pencil. So if I flatten too much of the tooth early on, then I might have issues with building up my layers like I am here. But as I've mentioned, I will happily burnish when I know I'm more towards the latter stages of my drawing because I know I don't have many layers left to add. This is going to be very individual though to the paper that I'm using, also the subject that I'm drawing, and what number of layers will be required. Moving on to the horn, and the layering technique that I'm using here, I would also be applying to antlers or any other horn of any animal, regardless of the shape. It's the texture here that I want to capture, but again, like the skin, I do want to focus on a good base layer first. So if I am working with a Highland cow horn, for example, or a red stag antlers, I do want to make sure that I'm following these stages. So although my values here aren't right or where they're going to be at the end, I'm really hinting at the placement of my lights and my darks. This is something that I do focus all of my real-time tutorials on, every aspect of pencil technique and of course how we should be layering. And I do record my step-by-step tutorials with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so I'm able to explain everything in the moment. A slight shift on how I'm holding the pencil, how I'm using the erasers is all explained. If those real-time tutorials are of interest, I'll link those in the description below. If you do have any questions about that as well, feel free to pop those in the comments. So as I'm starting to work with my pencils, you can see here that I am starting to refine the placement of the lights and the darks. Now the lights and the darks here, they do follow the underlying bone and muscular structure. So in this area here, although there's no skin or fur over the top, it is still following the structures, the shaping. So where I've got the shadow underneath, then it starts to get a little bit lighter as it curves over. This is helping with the rounded shape that's really crucial for something like this. And of course, the horn shape is going to be very unique to each animal. So the highlights and shadows will be different. The lighting will affect that as well. But it's important to make sure that we are getting this as accurate as possible. I would much rather get the accuracy of my contrast and the placement of my lights and darks rather than trying to focus more on adding every ounce of detail. So as I'm starting to then continue with my layers, gradually building in my darker values, this is where that shape and form is being reinforced at every possible stage. The depth here and that shaping is crucial. If I didn't have this area dark enough, it would look very flat. It wouldn't look like it's going around the shape. So here, my shadow, it's vital for this level of realism. And another consideration here is bounced light. So as I'm starting to build in the lighting on this smaller horn, you'll see that I'm actually adding in some highlights over the front surface where I'm going to also darken it. And this is because the top side of the longest horn, it does have a bright highlight, and it is then bouncing some of that light onto the front surface of the area of the smaller horn that I'm currently working on. So as I am darkening this here and then coming back in with my highlights with the erasers, I do need to get the balance right. If I was working smaller, I'd need to make sure that I wasn't overdoing the highlights because I would lift too much of that shadow. And the shadow here is very important. So it might be that I would only have space for 2 or 3 of the highlights, the finer dots, rather than what I'm currently going to be adding now. You can see that I am actually able to add a few more because of this area of the size that I'm working on. But if I overdo that, I'm going to remove too much of the shadow. So we really do need to make sure that we are getting this with that balance and ratio right for the size of the artwork that we are working on. Early on, I did mention in this video about how the highlights are brighter on the top part of the face, and you're going to really see that develop here. So above the eye, I've kept an area that is much lighter, and then I'm going to start to add my shadows around the contours of the edge of the face. So this is helping with determining the skull shape, the top of the eye socket, and how then the skull starts to curve over to where the ears are attached. You'll notice that when I'm working with my paper blending stamp and my graphite powder, that I'm already hinting at that shape and form. There's no details, there's no pencil work at all yet. But all of this is established because of the values that I'm using and the placement of those, which again is why I really do focus on this from start to finish. One other aspect that I do focus my real-time tutorials on is how much pressure we should be applying to an eraser or a pencil depending on the desired effect. Here I'm just using a piece of putty eraser and I'm demonstrating what to do and what not to do and answering the most common questions that I'm asked about pencil and layering technique. But as I continue to layer here, I'm going to be using more of the Tombow Mono Eraser, which is this eraser at the moment, to put in some softer looking highlights. Now varying the pressure here, I'm going to be able to create a range of these details. I don't want to have everything looking the same. If I want to have an area that's not quite so bright, then I can simply ease off, but that's also going to be determined by what my base foundation looks like. When I start working with my pencils, again, the pressure is also important. I want to be making sure that I'm not forcing too much pressure and burnishing. That will also create some more scribbly marks when working on something like this. Because this portion of the face, although the rhino skin is not going to be smooth, it's also not really bumpy or gritty looking. The variation on the skin texture here is what drew me to this reference photo. It enabled me to focus on a wide range of techniques in one project. So I was able to then show how the techniques can be transferred for drawing elephants, anything that has skin rather than fur or feathers. And one of the adjustments in the techniques that I'm doing here is you'll see that I'm coming in with my pencils and working in between some of my highlights if I need to darken areas. Now the main reason for this is because this area of the face is much lighter. I didn't want to make my base layer too dark. Whereas everywhere else up to this point, I've gone in with much more of a darker graphite powder layer. But if you want to be a little bit more cautious and you are a little bit concerned about not being able to pull your highlights in over the top, you can also use this approach as well. It's a little bit more time consuming, but for something like this with bright lighting, it is what's needed. Now the area underneath the ear here, it was actually quite confusing with how there were different creases. They were more rounded, of course, to show that the ear is attached onto the top of the head. And any area where we're getting more confused and we are still struggling with what we should be drawing at each time, we can always turn the artwork upside down and the reference photo upside down, and our brain will be forced to see it as abstract shapes rather than, in this situation, an ear. By doing that, it just helps to simplify that process, additionally to working in those smaller sections and one layer at a time. Now, if I did turn this upside down, I would still be following the same steps in picking out the main areas that stand out first, then working with a good base layer and then pulling in some of the highlights and shadows before adding in those final details. But it is something to try if an area is proving to be more difficult. It's something where we are still struggling with proportions. It can help to identify areas that need to be adjusted. Moving on to the back portion of this Rhino drawing, and you'll see that I'm using a eye makeup applicator to apply my graphite powder rather than the paper blending stump. Now the main reason for this is that it's a quicker application, but also it did give me a little bit more of a softer look, which I did feel was warranted for this area of the drawing. But once I've got this established, I'm going to be using the same steps. The only difference here is this skin texture, it is dramatically different. So the lines or wrinkles are far longer. They are therefore going to be a little bit more overlapped from the shoulder to the top portion of the back. But also I'm not just working with one solid line from left to right or top to bottom. You'll see now that I'm starting to break that pencil movement up so that I don't have lots of straight lines. By overlapping them this way and not really thinking too much about that pencil process, I'm able to capture more realism. This is something that I do focus this section of the real-time version on, because I think out of all of this so far, this is an area where we could sometimes maybe get a bit too carried away and use lazier techniques. Because of how many smaller, finer wrinkles are here, I think that we can just rush through with that pencil movement. And I don't want to end up with an area that looks like a load of scribbles. Especially because the amount of realism that's been captured so far is very high. I don't want this area of the drawing to bring everything else down. And I think this area here in particular demonstrates perfectly why it's important to build up in gradual layers. This here is a darker pencil, but if I'd have started with this, then I've lost out on all of those mid lines first. By building up my values, I've really enhanced this skin texture, and this area of the drawing didn't take as long as I thought because I was able to work with a looser style in terms of not overly being accurate with the millimeter placement of these lines. Again, that's something that I don't feel is going to enhance this realism, but they are all curving and going in the right direction. So by overlapping these lines, I'm building in more impression of detail with less pencil strokes because I'm not trying to make them absolutely perfect. But I can't stress enough, if I was working much larger, then that is something that I would be paying more attention to. If you're aiming for hyperrealism, where you don't want to be able to tell the difference between your drawing and your reference photo, then you need everything to be absolutely perfect. But in order to do that, you do need to work much larger. So once I've got my rough placement here of my lines the way that they are going, then I can start to work on the next phase. And by breaking this up in these stages, again, I'm able to make this less daunting. So if I'm now working with my erasers, I'm then going to remove some of my darker lines, but I'm getting my balance between highlights and shadows. Once I've got more of the pattern in with my highlights, then I can go back with my pencils and re-establish the darker lines. There are many different ways to get to the same end. You could technically have worked more light to dark and be a bit more cautious. It would have taken longer, but you could certainly do that. but this I found was the best way to get the same result but a quicker result. So I'm more than happy to spend hours on an area using slower techniques if I feel that's the best way to work. But for something like this, with this size of this drawing, with the number of lines here, I felt for what I wanted to establish and capture in my artwork, this was going to give me the best results. And yet again, always here, I'm using the same approach, but just making sure that I am either shortening my pencil strokes, I'm making them thicker in areas, just to show how the wrinkles or the creases and folds of that skin are varied. This is a great area where I need this to be slightly wider with the creases, the darker values, and they do need to be much darker than the cheek area right next to it. Because this portion of the neck goes backwards, it goes away from the camera a little bit more than the face. Having this variation, again a darker base layer as well, this helps with that proportion and the shaping. So when I'm working with my values, I'll be looking at the entire reference photo and trying to identify how dark should this area be compared to something else that's also dark in that reference photo, the nose for example. If I know that this area is much darker than the nose, then I have to come in with my darker graphite here and potentially, if I've made the nose too dark, go back in and lighten that. Because otherwise my values will look too similar and that could actually bring this portion of the neck forward so that I'm then lacking in that three-dimensional feel. So really making sure here that I am assessing that in my reference photo and not always zooming into that one area that I'm working on at that time. Making sure to zoom out of that photo is a very worthwhile thing to do very often to make sure that we're getting the balance of our values right. And the last part of this drawing was the feet. Now when working on something like this, regardless if it's the hands or feet of an animal or a person, I want to be making sure that I am very accurate with my highlights and shadows. So again, something that I have spoken about from start to finish in this video, but certainly when drawing hands and feet, this can really make such a big difference to how we mentally work through that area of the reference photo. Now when drawing fingers, if the shadows or the highlights around each of the knuckles is in the wrong place, that can make it look like the proportions of the entire hand are wrong, even though your outline, your sketch might be accurate. So this is where at my graphite powder layer, I will put emphasis on the placement early on. And I try to keep to that as much as I can when I work with my pencils. So as I'm starting to establish that, in this situation for a rhino or an elephant, it's not necessarily the knuckles with the highlights and shadows that are just as important. Also, the darker wrinkles are going to be hinting at the joints in the leg. So this dark area that I'm working on is helping to separate the toes. Then as I start to work higher up, the darker creases here will be hinting at the wrist. This is a key structure, and if these areas are not in the right place, we've drastically changed the shape of the leg. So this here, right from the beginning, is something that I want to make sure I get right. And just like the area of the neck directly above this leg, I needed to make sure that I had this area really dark because the head, the neck, it's leaning forward at that lower angle and that would be blocking out all light to this area. So if I did have highlights here or even lighter midtones, it's not going to look like this part of the leg is attached to the body, which of course would be a real problem. So the values here are very important with how dark that shadow needs to be. So with this drawing, because it was complex, there is a lot of areas here that required a huge amount of concentration. I did break this up into many drawing sessions over the space of a week or two. Now, you don't have to do that over that length of time if you're only working on one project. I've got multiple tutorials that I do every month, so I do like to rotate. But I would recommend to rest your eyes regularly once you've worked on one area before you then progress to the next. So let's say, for example, you'd finished the nose and then you were starting the horn. I would maybe have just half hour or overnight, a little break so that your eyes are fully rested before you do progress. Because if we're working with tired eyes, it can be very easy to rush the techniques that we're using here. So I do hope this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I do upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time version of this Rhino tutorial, then I'll link all of the information to that in the description below. If you have got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm always happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.